Hey everybody, welcome to day 6 of our virtual book study. We are doing chapter 6 today. Took a day off yesterday for some personal reasons, but we are back up and running, and I'm so glad that you are here. So, we are moving on to chapter 6, Anti-Blackness. Chapter 6, Anti-Blackness, and this is a quote. But all our phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience and that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscles, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions all land with great violence upon the body. That quote is from Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. Racism is complex and nuanced, and its manifestations are not the same for every group of color. To challenge the ideologies of racism, such as individualism and colorblindness, we as white people must suspend our perception of ourselves as unique and or outside race. Exploring our collective racial identity interrupts a key privilege of dominance, the ability to see oneself only as an individual. We need to discuss white people as a group, even if doing so jars us, in order to disrupt our unracialized identities. For people of color, the privilege of being seen and seeing themselves as unique individuals outside the context of race cannot be taken for granted. Talking about race and racism in general terms, such as white people, is constructive for whites because it interrupts individualism. But racial generalization also reinforces something problematic for people of color: the continual focus on their group identity. Furthermore, it collapses many racial groups into one generic category, thereby denying the specific ways that different groups experience racism. While people of color share some experiences of racism, overall there are also variations based on a specific group's history. These variations include how group members have adapted to the dominant culture, how they have been represented, how they have been positioned in relation to other groups of color, and the quote role the group has been assigned by dominant society. The messages I have internalized about people of Asian heritage, for example, are not the same as those I have internalized for indigenous people. And a key aspect of challenging these messages is the identity that differences and how that messages is to identify their differences and how they shape my attitudes towards various groups of color. Further, there are myriad groups within these categories, and I have different attitudes here too. For example, my stereotypes about Japanese people are not the same as my stereotypes about Chinese people, and these stereotypes inform different responses. In this chapter, I will address the uniquely anti-Black sentiment integral to white identity. In doing so, I do not wish to minimize the racism that other groups of color experience. However, I believe that in the white mind, Black people are the ultimate racial, quote, other, and we must grapple with this relationship, for it is a foundational aspect of the racial socialization underlying white fragility. I remind my readers that I am addressing white people at the societal level. I have friends who are Black and whom I love deeply. I do not have to suppress feelings of hatred and contempt as I sit with them. I see their humanity. But on the macro level, I also recognize the deep anti-Black feelings that have been inculcated in me since childhood. These feelings surface immediately. In fact, before I can even think. When I conceptualize Black people in general, the sentiments arise when I pass Black strangers on the street, see stereotypical depictions of Black people in the media, and hear the thinly veiled warnings and jokes passed between white people. These are the deeper feelings that I need to be willing to examine, for these feelings can and do seep out without any awareness, and hurt those whom I love. As discussed in previous chapters, we live in a culture that circulates relentless messages of white superiority. These messages exist simultaneously with relentless messages of Black inferiority. But anti-Blackness goes deeper than the negative stereotypes all of us have absorbed. Anti-Blackness is foundational to our very identities as white people. Whiteness has always been predicated on Blackness. As discussed in Chapter 2, there was no concept of race or a white race before the need to justify the enslavement of Africans. Creating a separate and inferior black race simultaneously created the, quote, superior white race. One concept could not exist without the other. In this sense, whites need black people. Blackness is essential to the creation of white identity. Scholars have argued that whites split off from themselves and project onto black people the aspects that we don't want to own in ourselves. For example, the white masters of enslaved Africans consistently depicted the Africans as lazy and childlike, even as they toiled at backbreaking work from sunup to sundown. Today we depict blacks as dangerous, a portrayal that perverts the true direction of violence between whites and blacks since the founding of this country. This characterization causes aversion and hostility toward black people, and feelings of superiority toward ourselves, but we cannot morally acknowledge any of these feelings. To reiterate, I am speaking here of the collective white consciousness. An individual white person may not be explicitly aware of these feelings, but I am often amazed at how quickly they surface with even the slightest challenge. Consider the enduring white resentment about the perceived injustices of affirmative action programs. There is empirical evidence that people of color, especially black people, have been discriminated against in hiring since the ending of enslavement and into the present. In the late 1960s, a program was instituted to help ameliorate this discrimination, affirmative action. There is a great amount of misinformation about affirmative action, as evidenced in the idea of special rights. For example, people commonly believe that if a person of color applies for a position, he or she must be hired over a white person. That black people are given preferential treatment in hiring, and that a specific number of people of color must be hired to fill a quota. All these beliefs are patently untrue. Affirmative action is a tool to ensure that qualified minority applicants are given the same employment opportunities as white people. It is a flexible program. There are no quotas or requirements as commonly understood. Moreover, white women have been the greatest beneficiaries of affirmative action, although the program did not initially include them. Corporations are more likely to favor white women and immigrants of color of elite backgrounds from outside of the United States when choosing their executives. No employer is required to hire an unqualified person of color, but companies are required to be able to articulate why they didn't hire a qualified person of color, and this requirement is rarely enforced. Additionally, affirmative action never applied to private companies, only to state and governmental agencies. Still, this program has been systematically chipped away at, and several states have eliminated affirmative action programs altogether. In turn, African Americans continue to be the most underrepresented group at the organizational leadership level. In 2018, affirmative action has all but been dismantled. Yet invariably, I will encounter a white male, bristling with umbrage, who raises the issue of affirmative action. It seems that we white people just cannot let go of our outrage over how unfair this toothless attempt to rectify centuries of injustice has been to us. And this umbrage consistently surfaces in overwhelmingly white leadership groups that have asked me to come in and help them recruit and retain more people of color. Copious research attests to the disdain of whites for African Americans, from the school to prison pipeline, to mass incarceration, to white flight. For example, on attitude surveys, most whites say they would prefer neighborhoods that are no more than 30% black, and more than half of whites say they would not move into a neighborhood that is 30% black or more. Studies of actual mobility patterns not only confirm these preferences, but also show that whites downplay them. White flight has been triggered when a formerly white neighborhood reaches 7% black, And in neighborhoods with more than a few black families, white housing demand tends to disappear. That is, the demand disappears unless white people need that housing because of unaffordable home prices in other neighborhoods. In that case, black people are pushed out as gentrification increases. Brooklyn, Harlem, Oakland, and Seattle are prime examples. A 2015 study by the American Sociological Foundation found that the highest level of segregation is between blacks and whites. The lowest is between Asian and whites. And the level between Latinx and whites occupies an intermediate position. A majority of whites, in both the expression of their beliefs and the practices of their lives, do not want to integrate with blacks. We see anti-black sentiment in how quickly images of brutality toward black children, let alone black adults, are justified by the white assumption that it must have been deserved. Such beliefs would be unimaginable if we had been shown images of white teens being thrown across schoolrooms, of white kindergartners handcuffed, of a white child shot while playing with a toy gun in the park. We see anti-black sentiment in the immediate rejoinder to Black Lives Matter, that all lives matter, that blue lives matter, and in the absurdly false comparison between the white nationalists and the alt-right movement, now directly connected to the White House. With the Black Panther Party of the 1960s, we see anti-blackness in how much more harshly we criticize blacks by every measure. We see it in the President of the United States, positioning the avowed white supremacists, neo-Nazis marching openly in the streets, including one man who drove a car into a crowd of protesters, as equal in character to the people protesting them. As Coates notes, quote, the case for reparations. The early American economy was built on slave labor. The Capitol and the White House were built by slaves. President James K. Polk traded slaves from the Oval Office. The laments about, quote, black pathology, the criticism of black family structures by pundits and intellectuals, ring hollow in a country whose existence was predicated on the torture of black fathers, on the rape of black mothers, on the sale of black children. An honest assessment of America's relationship to the black family reveals the country to be not its nurturer, but its destroyer. And this destruction did not end with slavery. Anti-blackness is rooted in misfortune, fables, perversions, projections, and lies. It is also rooted in a lack of historical knowledge and an inability of unwillingness to trace the effects of history into the present. But perhaps, most fundamentally, anti-blackness comes from deep guilt about what we have done and continue to do. The unbearable knowledge of our complicity with the profound torture of black people from past to present. While the full trauma of this torture in its various forms, both physically and psychologically, is only borne by African Americans, there is a kind of moral trauma in it for the white collective. In this revolutionary book, My Grandmother's Hands, social worker and therapist Resmaa Menakem refers to white supremacy as white body supremacy, to argue that white supremacy is a form of trauma that is stored in our collective bodies. Many African Americans know trauma intimately, from our own nervous systems, from the experiences of people they love, and, most often, from both. But African Americans are not alone in this. A different but equal form of racialized trauma lives in the bodies of both white Americans and most white Americans. Our projections allow us to bury this trauma by dehumanizing and then blaming the victim. If blacks are not human in the same way that we are white people, our mistreatment of them doesn't count. We are not guilty. They are. If they are bad, it isn't unfair. In fact, it is righteous. There is a curious satisfaction in the punishment of black people, the smiling faces of the white crowd picnicking at lynchings in the past, and the satisfied approval of white people observing mass incarceration and execution in the present. White righteousness, when inflicting pain on African Americans, is evident in the glee the white collective derives from blackface and depictions of the blacks as apes and gorillas. We see it in the compassion toward white people who are addicted to opiates and called to provide them with services versus the mandatory sentencing perpetrated against those addicted to crack. We see it in the concern about the, quote, forgotten white working class, so critical to the outcome of the last presidential election, with no concern for blacks, who remain on the bottom of virtually every social and economic measure. As Coates points out, quote, toiling blacks are in their proper state. Toiling whites raise the specter of white slavery. Coates refers to white people as dreamers in the dream, falsely believing that they are actually white. I take this to mean that whites can only be white if someone is not white. If someone is the opposite of white, white is a false identity, an identity of false superiority. In that sense, whiteness isn't real. The dream of, quote, perfect world, unpolluted by blacks. If whites are to construct this world, blacks must be separated through state violence. Yet they still must exist, for the existence of blacks provides the needed other against which whites may rise. Thus, white identity depends in particular on the projection of inferiority onto blacks, and the oppression this inferior status justifies for the white collective. To put it bluntly, I believe that the white collective fundamentally hates blackness for what it reminds us of, that we are capable and guilty of perpetrating immeasurable harm, and that our gains come through the subjugation of others. We have a particular hatred for, quote, uppity blacks, those who dare to step out of their place and look us in the eye as equals. The messages that circulate relentlessly across the generations reinforce the white belief that blacks are inherently undeserving, a frankly outrageous belief given the state-sanctioned robbery of their labor. We heard their message in the narrative of, quote, welfare cheats and, quote, welfare queens in the Reagan era. We see it today when commentators slam National Football League players who kneel during the national anthem and exercise their right to protest police brutality as, quote, ungrateful. And when former Congressman Joe Walsh declares that Stevie Wonder is, quote, another ungrateful black multimillionaire. We see it when Robert Jeffress, Dallas evangelical pastor and advisor to the President of the United States, claims that NFL players who protest police brutality against African Americans should thank God they don't have to worry about being shot in the head. Quote, likely they would be in the, quote, North Korea. We see it in the outrage of the crowd of white progressives who showed up to hear Bernie Sanders speak in Seattle, were asked by black activists to grant 4.5 minutes of silence to honor Michael Brown, an unarmed black man shot by police in Ferguson, Missouri. Quote, how dare you, quote, the crowd cried. Carol Anderson, in her book White Rage, argues that, quote, the trigger for white rage inevitably is black advancement. It is not the mere presence of black people that is the problem. Rather, it is blackness within ambition, with drive, with purpose, with aspirations, and with demands for full and equal citizenship. It is blackness that refuses to accept subjugation, to give up. She continues, quote, the truth is that, despite all this, a black man was elected president of the United States, the ultimate advancement, and thus the ultimate affront. Perhaps not surprisingly, voting rights were severely curtailed. The federal government was shut down, and more than once the office of the president was shockingly openly and publicly disrespected by other elected officials. Anti-blackness is a complex and confusing stew of resentment and benevolence, for we also use blacks to feel warm-hearted and noble. We are drawn to those who cast their eyes downward in our presence, the ones we can, quote, save from the horrors of their black lives with our abundance and kindness. Consider an example I often use in my presentations, The Blind Side, a hugely popular movie from which Sandra Bullock received an Academy Award. This film is a cogent example of whites as the racially benevolent side of the coin. The film is based on the, quote, true story of the family of the Toys, who rescued Michael O'Hare, a black man who came from the impoverished family circumstances and who went on to become an NFL player. Although the movie was popular with white audiences, many problematic racial narratives are reinscribed in the film. In fact, there are no black characters who do not reinforce negative racial stereotypes. O'Hare himself is portrayed as the childlike gentle giant who lives in abject poverty. Sprinkled in are his drug-addicted single mother with his multiple children from unknown fathers, the incompetent welfare worker, the uppity lawyer, and the menacing gang members in his drug-infested and crime-ridden neighborhood. In one pivotal scene, O'Hare returns to his former neighborhood. As he walks down the street, he is surrounded by a gang that tries to intimidate him. While he considers his limited options, Mrs. Tuohy arrives and confronts the gang members, who quickly back down and retreat. Rescued by Mrs. Tuohy, O'Hare is returned back to safe, white suburbia. The scene makes it clear the only way O'Hare could be saved was from the terrors of his own black community is through the benevolence and bravery of a white family. In the film, white professionals discuss O'Hare as if he were developmentally disabled. He certainly comes off as such. He is passive and inarticulate throughout the movie. His teacher note that on his IQ test, he scored in the bottom percentile in, quote, ability to learn, but in the top percentile in, quote, protective instinct. As a professor of education who has never heard of test measuring, quote, protective instinct, I have been unable to find evidence in this bizarre measurement. It is highly problematic that O'Hare, as a black male, is portrayed as severely lacking in intellectual abilities, but exceptional in something instinctual. His limited intellectual capacity is reinforced throughout the film. For example, when the youngest child of the Tuohy household was to teach O'Hare how to play football. According to the film, O'Hare is never able to understand the rules of the game. So Mrs. Tuohy appeals to his, quote, protective instinct by telling him to protect one of his new white family members is going to be hurt. Once his instincts are engaged, rather than his intellect, he is unstoppable on the field. In a particularly insulting scene, the white child who tried unsuccessfully to teach O'Hare how to play football sits at a table negotiating a contract for him with powerful adult men, while O'Hare sits in the background, mute. This film, told from the white perspective and enthusiastically received by audiences, reinforces some very important dominant ideologies. White people are the savior of black people. Some black children may be innocent, but black adults are morally and criminally corrupt. Whites who are willing to save or otherwise help black people at seemingly great personal cost are noble, courageous, and morally superior to other whites. Individual black people can overcome circumstances, but usually only with the help of white people. Black neighborhoods are inherently dangerous and criminal. Virtually all blacks are poor, incompetent, and unqualified for their jobs. They belong to gangs, are addicted to drugs, and are bad parents. The most dependable route for black males to escape the, quote, inner city is through sports. White people are willing to deal with individual, quote, deserving black people, but whites do not become a part of the black community in any meaningful way beyond charity work. Of course, O'Hare also brings redemption to the whites who save him. The film ends with a voiceover from Mrs. Tuohy, a Christian claiming it was God's will that this boy be saved, presumably because his talent on the field made him more profitable and thus valuable to white people. The Tuohys, of course, are the good whites, who have to deal with the prejudice of individual bad whites they encounter at the country club and other places. In this way, the racist equal bad / not racist equal good binary is also reinforced. The film is fundamentally and insidiously anti-black. White racial socialization engenders many conflicting feelings toward African Americans: benevolence, resentment, superiority, hatred, and guilt roil barely below the surface and erupt at the slightest breach, yet can never be explicitly acknowledged. Our need to deny the bewildering manifestations of anti-Blackness that reside so close to the surface makes us irrational. And that irrationality is at the heart of white fragility and the pain it causes people of color. Thank you for listening.